Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy and narrative. I am here discussing Morphology of the Folktale by Propp. Mm-hmm. I am here with Stephen Rossi.
Let's talk the method and the material.
And Scott Thurlow.
And I'm all function, baby.
Okay. So this is kind of a strange one because I read the entire work while the others read chapters 2 and 3, which are the main, meat of this work. So I'm going to just dive in quickly with a brief discussion of the introduction to this, which will set up where Propp is coming from and whatnot.
Teach us.
Okay, so the Russians and the Slavic tradition of folktales and other tales that...
Similar stories.
Yeah, exactly. Were only really collected in the 19th century. And it was an epics, folktales, all done with oral tradition, as many of these kind of tales are. But again, this was collected very late. And Propp came about around when all the collection happened. And he's a formalist, which he has his background in kind of the Finnish formalism. And he describes his efforts in this work to both look at the set of folktales and what makes a specific tale a folktale versus being a epic or a
different
fairy tale and all of those kind of sets. And what's really interesting is, and you know how you all know I'm a fan of set theory. It's what is a set of folktales? It's like, what is a set of games? What is a set of sports? What differentiates these specifically to be in that set? So he describes the kind of history of analysis that went prior to the formalists, saying that there's a lot of historical and evolutionary look into folktales, specifically looking across different cultures and what are these different themes that can be determined from South American folktales that are similar to Grecian folktales, which are similar to Russian ones. Then they came into broad classification, which is fairy tales, animal tales, fairy tales with with animals in them, animal tales that have fairy tale elements, all that. And the problem is that the same message can vary over classification in different tribes. So he says that both the historical evolutionary and the broad classification all have their flaws. And then the next one was to look at plots and try to see what the specific plots dealt with over. But this also has all of the issues with classification. And it's also the permutation of plot that
I like that
different plot elements can exist in different tales, even though they're classified as different. Like, why is this subtly different than the other? And then the next one was was motifs, and looking into what were the themes that really mattered in a theme. So I have a quote about this, which was excuse me for one moment, a Finnish philosopher named Veskolowski, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, a plot is a series of motifs. A motif develops into a plot. Plots vary. Several motifs intrude upon a plot, or else plots combine with one another. By plot, I mean a theme in which different situation motifs are involved. For Veskolowski, motif is something primary, plot secondary. A plot is, for him, a creative unifying act. From this, we realize that study must be concentrated not so much with plots as with motifs. Yeah. Which our discussion with Joseph Campbell earlier is very much in line with that view. Yeah. And also, I have one thing I forgot to mention is that he has a concerted effort at accessibility with his work.
Yes.
Formalism is
notoriously inaccessible, I guess we might say.
Yeah, because it deals with a lot of as private notation, if you will, like with the person who within a school of formalism has their own notation involved, and it's both inaccessible to other people who within formalism and to people trying to learn this.
And certainly those
in general.
without it, yeah.
So his purpose overall is abstraction and, in a sense, the grammar of folktales. For those, I have a linguistics background. For those in linguistics, it's the syntax of what makes a folktale. Yeah. And one of the key things about folktales are the transference of elements from one folktale to another can be easily done. You can take a character from one, plop it in another, and it just works. Think of Hercules back in the day, which a mythology, yes, but can also be just whether you're dealing with the old Grecian things, the modern Greek kind of cheap films that they used to make, Hercules in New York, to Marvel Comics with Hercules as a character there.
Let's not forget about Kevin Sorbo.
Oh, Kevin Sorbo, absolutely. Of course. Actually, a very modern example for our American audience would be the use of Norse figures in Marvel movies. You can just take Odin, Thor, and Loki out of out of the mythology and place them into space battles in the future, and all of a sudden,
and it works.
It works, yeah.
It's sort of like almost like a Lego linguistics, if you will, approach, right? Like, and he'll certainly go. We'll go in more to that because that's what Propp does. But this is sort of the general idea, more or less. Like you can take one element or function as he deems it, right, and sort of shuffle it around, put it from here, A to B, C to D, and it'll still generally almost always work within that structure.
And I think what's more important is not necessarily Hercules or Thor, but what they represent.
Yes, exactly.
A lightning god and a powerful human-like demigod. Yeah. And that's recognizable. And you can see, in a sense, like storm gods and Zeus as in the classic Christian god, and religions all around the thing.
Facets,
yes,
sure.
So it's what they represent. So, all right, that is basically the finish with the introduction, and then we will proceed with the main part that you guys read. So before we begin, do you guys have any thoughts?
I mean, I have a couple, but maybe it's more pertinent to later on when we get into the discussion. But since you did bring it up, the general gist of this is that, to me, it's very reminiscent of Hero 1,000 Faces and compelling sort of ways of analyzing narrative. Even though this had come first, just that the history was, when Propp did his analysis, it was not translated to the Western world, if you will, until like 40 years later or so. Yeah. But it's certainly very impactful and influential. It's just that we happen, because we're more, I guess, generally immersed in the Western academia of these studies, we happen to come upon Campbell first, and also a little bit of Roland Barthes. At least I personally picked up hints of for this work. So it's just that clearly this was influential, just almost retroactively to a degree. But it certainly is in the same vein of those kinds of studies. Is the point I'm trying to make.
At least Campbell and Propp feel that they got their worldview through this preceding school of thought that came.
Exactly.
And I'm not saying Propp is not influential. I'm just saying that I don't necessarily you can draw a direct line from him to Campbell. I think it's that this was very in fashion over the school of thought that was happening at the time.
All right, maybe. All I'm saying is, to me, they seem quite similar. And I mean, I like this area, like this avenue of breaking down narrative in such a way. But to me, maybe you're right, maybe not a direct line, but in some way they're related, or at least you can see the progression there, is all I'm saying.
I mean, I would say in the same way as Campbell did later, this book, and especially the parts that we read, I can't speak to the other parts, but it's a way to illuminate the tropes of the stories of the time, or the stories that have come before. The specifically fairy tales in this one, but the kind of myths and mythology that I think that both of them saw the ways that stories presented themselves and undertook to try to demystify the way that a story is told
at least analyze how and why it works.
Right.
If not demystify it per se. Sure.
All right, so he goes on in the first section, or the second section, I would say, to actually define what a function is.
Yeah.
And there are a couple, I guess, 4 rules I have here. Functions serve as stable, constant elements in folktales, independent of who performs them and how they're fulfilled by the dramatis personae. They constitute the components of a folktale. 2. The number of functions known in the fairy tale is limited.
Mm-hmm.
3. The sequence of functions is always identical. And 4. All fairy tales by their structure belong to one and the same type. So, in a way, he's saying the set of fairy tales have elements that are sets themselves.
Right.
And they're
arranged in a more or less general order all the time.
Yeah, I mean, if
you disagree, let me know.
There's certain functions that just physically can't precede another function.
Right, and certain ones conversely.
Almost like putting in a quote at the beginning of a sentence means you have to end it with a second quote.
Yeah, and like I'm saying, conversely as well, like there are certain ones that have to precede others.
Yeah, in that way, there's a quote that I had highlighted, which says, "The sequence of events has its own laws. The short story, too, has similar laws, as do organic formations. Theft cannot take place before the door is forced." Which I
remember that one. It's pretty good. Yeah, you're right. To your point, it's sort of laying out this general idea of that's what he's trying to look at and sort of tease out of the study of all these tales, and then he's about to show you how and why this works, or at least his theory of it.
Right.
So I'm going to enumerate the different functions now. I'm not going to go into much detail about them aside from describing them. If you gentlemen have anything to say about a particular one, please interrupt.
Well, there is a... perhaps we should say what all the functions are first. There is a footnote in this that says, before you read this section, look through all the functions and somewhat familiarize yourself with what they are.
That's what I'm about to do, though.
Yeah, and then go back and read about what each of them are.
So he's saying, we're doing what he suggested before we talk about it. Exactly. Go on.
All right. So the first one is one of the members of the family is absent from home. Designation, the absence. 2, an interdiction is addressed to the hero. Definition, interdiction. Now, I will clarify that, where think of it as the mother warning the child not to...
Don't go to the haunted forest or whatever. Yeah.
But that is often present in fairy tales. 3, the interdiction is, of course, violated.
Yep.
Obviously.
And going back to that example... The interdiction cannot be violated if an interdiction is not put into place beforehand. Yes. 4, the villain makes an attempt at reconnaissance. 5, the villain receives information about his victim. 6, the villain attempts to deceive his victim in order to take possession of him or his belongings. 7, the victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. 8, the villain causes harm or injury to one member of a family. This is actually the really important one. And harm can take, this is a very, very broad function.
It can take various forms.
And I think it's perhaps the most important one because this is the impetus to action.
Well, it sets up the central conflict pretty much. Yeah.
Or is the central...
Yeah, you're right. It embodies it, yeah.
Harm can take place in everything from a kidnapping to a stealing of a precious item to murder. I mean, it could be any particular thing.
It's got a myriad ways to manifest.
19 possibilities of the way that this one can work.
Yeah, which we'll not read out, but just to give an example as to how, the many ways it can take shape in the stories. Go on, what are we at now?
8, one member of a family lacks something, he desires to have something. I think this is the alternate to the villainy one, which is basically the quest thing. I need you to go out and seek an item of sorts.
Yeah, I think that's... is that 8? I guess it's
8A, 8A which is, again, the alternate to the impetus to action. 9 is misfortune or shortage is made known. The hero is either approached with a request and responds to it of his own accord, or is commanded and dispatched.
But thou must go get whatever. Magic chickens.
I should have what you have. The
You want to switch?
no. He has the.
I'm just
Kindle
like
here.
swapping or flicking through.
You're an old
pages.
school guy, and you're going old school with the paper.
So it's
10 is the seeker agrees to or decides upon counteraction. I actually tested this out to see if I could flip all of these.
It went better in pre-post.
Well, of course it did.
Yeah.
What is this? 11. The hero leaves home. 12. The hero is tested, interrogated, attacked, etc. in preparation for receiving either a magical agent or helper. Which, very Campbellian.
That was those
Yeah.
two, and the next 2 or 3 as well, are the strongest ones reminiscent to me of Campbellian sort of breakdowns.
It's just all not going.
The villain in this case is the book itself for study.
Yes. Here's the thing is, I didn't actually test it with holding something else in my hand.
He forgot about this variable.
Do you want me to take over?
Yeah, if you could.
Or just
All right,
give him
yeah,
the fucking thing.
I'll take over if you want to just flip
Yeah.
through.
You do some talking.
All
right,
You do
so-
some work here.
Let's move on to 13.
You ought to do
13.
some driving.
The hero reacts, and to be fair, mine are, because this is a different translation, mine are slightly differently worded, but you'll still get the same idea. So 13, the hero reacts to the actions of the future donor,
Oh, we should classify the donor before we go on.
and there is a subnote here. In the majority of instances, the reaction is either positive or negative.
The donor in the Campbellian terms is
The
the...
Threshold Guardian?
What?
Oh, no.
The benefactor.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
It is someone who, whether it's a benevolent witch, maybe even malevolent witch, who the hero has to trick.
Right.
If it's someone with an item that can be bestowed upon the hero.
Or is given after, like, again, an interrogation, I think you just said. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Steve.
And they give a bunch of instances of that as well. 14 is the hero acquires the use of a magical agent.
Now, agent being, again, a many myriad
Right.
possibilities.
Can be a lot of different things. And
And this is all abstraction.
yeah, because there are, I think he's like working from a list of like 250 stories or something like that.
think it
So
might be a
he
little
gives a
less,
bunch
but-
of examples throughout here as well from each of them. But this is actually a fairly long section. There's like one so we'll come back to this, but
Return journey.
after this section is the figure, which maybe we should try to put this up. It's like the line figure with a bunch of
Sort of a diagram of how these all,
Yeah, of how
all the
everything
functions
connects.
connect. Yeah, exactly.
which is really interesting to try and first of all try and figure out, because there's a billion lines going back and forth. But
The 15 is the hero is transferred, reaches, or is led to the whereabouts of an object of search, which can be, like, again, their goal that they're achieving, the kidnapped princess,
brother,
Right.
whatever. Yeah.
the treasure chest hidden in the depths, all these kind of things. Are you...
sorry, 16 is the hero and the villain join in direct combat.
Mm-hmm. Climactic duel.
17 is the hero is branded, which I thought was an interesting one as well. Like something that I didn't really think about, but happens all the time, is like you get
Some sort of
like-
signifier
yeah.
or something.
you either get something like directly branded onto you, or like could be anything. Could be like a hat or something.
It could be you losing a battle and a scar.
Right.
That happens, but it's some sort of
Some sort
signifier
of
of a
exactly.
test.
Yeah.
Exactly.
18 is the villain is defeated. The initial defeat of the villain is this one.
Yeah, that's true. Because
Well, that's the thing is, it can be either. At this moment, the villain could be defeated,
Right. Could be the
or
end.
might not.
Yeah. 19, the initial misfortune or lack is liquidated. So again, that could be like kind
you
of
get your
the
gold
end.
back, you recover your ancestral home.
20
Yeah.
is the hero returns. Ah, the return.
As I just
Very
said.
Campbellian.
Got the return. 21, the hero is pursued.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to keep going after the return, the hero is pursued. 22 is the rescue of the hero from pursuit via magical or other means.
sometimes via the magical agent that you mentioned in the like 12 or 13.
23 is the hero, unrecognized, arrives home or in another country.
Very sort of Odysseus style, if you will.
Yeah.
Absolutely. 24, a false hero presents unfounded claims.
The suitors in Odysseus.
Now, I hate to keep drawing it, because it's based on Russian literature, but just for easy examples for those out there.
Well, I think this is based on a bunch of, because I recognized a bunch of standard myths and folk tales in the examples in here as well.
They could be Russian. Just because they're Russian doesn't mean they're standard.
Well, one of them's like Hansel and Gretel.
Yeah.
Which I think is German.
Isn't that German?
I'm pretty sure it's German.
Go on.
It was Russian initially.
25. Sure. 25. A difficult task is proposed to the hero. And 26. The task is resolved.
Both giving their identity, or proving their identity, and then presenting themselves as the true. Again, going to Odysseus, that is very much a part of that.
Absolutely. 27, the hero is recognized. 28, the false hero or villain is exposed, which I think these are two kinds of the same, like sides of the same coin almost. Like,
well, it depends somewhat on the specifics of the tale, but they generally like serve the same function.
Yeah, like in recognizing the hero as the hero, you recognize the false hero as the villain.
Exactly.
Right. 29, the hero is given a new appearance. Then this can be like either new clothes, a new form, or like even a new house, or like palace or something like that.
The knight becomes king while marrying the princess.
Right.
That kind of
that
rise
kind of
in stature.
Yeah.
30, the villain is punished. 31, the hero is married and ascends the throne.
And or variations thereof.
Right, and there are a bunch of variations of that, but that's kind of the main one, and I believe that's it.
That's it, right? Those are the only elements of every folktale ever.
And they just mix and match to make your own folktale.
Yeah.
Like I said, Lego linguistics. But no, like it is.
But you kind of have to do them in this order. You can just skip some of them.
Or at least an order, in order in which, like, again...
No. This order. You can't...
Some can be paired, though. That's the point I was going to go next. Like, they can be paired and sometimes, like, inverted, but nevertheless, that the order is still the same. Just some of the details might change, is all I was trying to get out there.
Yeah, indeed. But again, remember, theft cannot occur before you've broken down the door.
That's what I was going to get at. Sure. You can still plug and play them, but you still have to go in a logical and necessary order, which the narrative demands in order to make any sense or to extract a tale whatsoever.
So I have a formalist argument that I would like to hear Propp, if we can resurrect him.
Let's get him on the horn.
We're working on it.
I like formalist arguments. I enjoy reading them. I enjoy reading Gamble. I like semantics in linguistics and all that. The question I have is, let's say this is a definitive recipe for a folktale.
Sure.
What makes a story within the set of stories? So if it's a folktale, is there not a superset of just narratives?
That then folktale falls beneath?
That folktale is beneath. And are any of these... Because we mentioned, this one is reminiscent of Campbell's way of describing myths. Are these more not unique to a folktale or a myth, but general narrative and overarching? Yes.
I think yes and no. Like, it's going to depend, right? Certainly, like you said, like you're a great fan of set theory, and I largely enjoy it as well. And I think it's very much applied here, and sort of that's what Propp is going for. It seems, right? So yeah, you've got your the largest set ever of all, so let's say narrative elements or functions as he terms them. So we'll go with that, right? And then a subset of functions is A1 or whatever, and then a subset of that is all the functions which are contained in these tales, which these tales have, but can be also utilized by other types of narrative. I think that's sort of how I answer it. It would seem to me like Propp might more or less agree with that, or at least that's what I extracted from his analysis.
I think the one obvious that I mentioned earlier was that I think the villain causes a harm. Well, that's in almost
that's in every
single
fucking
narrative.
story in the world. And like the hero battles the villain. Like, that is in no way specific to these kinds of tales, but certainly it's a narrative element that would be one that like sort of goes all the way down, if you will, like the narrative tree.
But I would say, like, I appreciate this work, or this book
section of this study
a lot, because we're kind of going heavily back into like breaking down narrative, and I think that you can look at this as like, the villain causes a harm is something that happens in a way in pretty much every story, but in folktales, fairy tales, there is a almost 201 a physical
element which portrays that.
There's like a physical antagonist, right? And like we've been talking a lot about movies lately, which are obviously their own types of stories, and a lot of times recently we've been like, there's no actual like antagonist, like there's no physical manifestation of an antagonist. It's like there's something in society that these characters are battling against. So like if you're looking for something different between folktales and like a larger section of
that might be an angle
stories that might be different than what's being talked about here, it might be that there is as stories move forward from being like these mythologies that are meant to teach a lesson, there's a move away from having this physical manifestation of an antagonist or villain, right? Like, well, the villain isn't always as obvious, right? In other stories as it is in fairy tales and folk tales, usually, I would say.
Interesting thoughts. I'm going to bring up Avengers Infinity War for a moment.
All right, let's tie them both together.
I would actually like to, because I think you could
apply this,
fascinating analysis, because Rocket Raccoon, Animal Tale.
Yeah.
Thor and Loki, mythology. You have demigods in Chris Pratt's Star-Lord. You have...
That's true.
Like, there are so many different... such a myriad of different... As you said, if you want to grab the big book of classifications of tales, I think that someone in the Marvel comics stand aside, because they're definitely cover everything possible. Sure. But even the movie itself covers so much of these different aspects that it breaks, I think, the system in a way that it takes bits and pieces of every single type of
of mashes them all together.
Mythology, animal tale, fairy tale, all the different types of tales you can, and put them all together into one. And is that a new thing? Is it like?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. Go on.
Like, I think you can actually get a doctorate if you pulled that off. Like, you could do that as like a thesis paper on where everything lies in there.
Well, you absolutely should do that in your studies currently or soon thereafter. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, that's a really good point, because we discussed it a bit as well. Like, again, I hesitate to keep coming back to Campbell, but I think it's sort of unavoidable because the studies that are being done in both are so similar. So if you can apply, like, if you can see that the formats, or what did we just say? Sorry, what are they called? I'm blanking on this now.
The functions?
The functions, yes. If you know the core functions, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can slap that onto, I don't know, a more quote-unquote modern-day tale, but you can still draw a clear parallel between them. And if you know how they're used and can use them well, then yeah, you can almost recreate all those tales and like even mash them together in I guess a more bombastic way than the original one, than the source material. But you can still see where they've come from and how they're being used. A la the Infinity War. I think that's a really pretty good example, because, I mean, it's a pretty obvious touchstone or like pop culture property that many people know, but you might not know that it seems that they're using a lot of this stuff in order to build the story and advance it.
Yeah.
I just thought that was, like, as I was reading I'm like, this did this did this. Is it's a neat little...
Dude, that's pretty spot on.
That is a great point. And but what I really like about this is, you're right, they like this does kind of cover a subsection, but it's an interesting take on breaking down narrative a lot further and like more distinctly than a lot of other things have done, other than perhaps Campbell. Like, you know, we read SZ a while ago, and but that focused on one thing, on one work.
SC actually, well, it did focus on one work, but SC wasn't about one school. It was about uniting, I feel, all the schools into one, that you don't limit yourself
a number of them
on what you're talking about, because you put it in the braid so that you can cover everything in once.
Yeah.
That every single line represents something. And maybe the braid works with Infinity War, which in a scene with Rocket Raccoon, when Thor, you have a mythological thing with an animal tail, and then
sort of,
Rocket Raccoon and Groot by themselves is more just a pure animal tail.
Right, sort of veers to a different angle of it, style of it, sure.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's interesting, and it's things that I'm sure people were not actively thinking about when they were writing that script, but it's a way of,
I mean, maybe
it's a way of like mapping the stories of today. Like you can see functions of this work in the stories of today for sure. It's super easy to see that, and like stories haven't worked all that differently since people started telling stories, but there are differences that like you can see in here. However, what I like about this is, you know, you get to a certain point of this, and it's like, well, this story could keep going, or this could be it. Like, you know, like I think it's going to end at like the 18, function 18 or whatever, and it goes up to 30 because there are stories that just keep going after the initial defeat of the villain, or like, you know, things like that. I think there's no mention of like a dragon character or whatever in this, like a secondary villain, but that's kind of what the initial defeat of the villain is when it keeps going, I think.
Well, I believe that generally in traditional folktales, they're simple stories.
Yeah.
It's only kind of in modern times
as they've expanded and get more complicated.
Later on, he discusses the fact that a folktale can be only one of these.
Right.
That you can have that as a sole story. And I thought that was pretty interesting, although I think we would be disappointed with the story that only had one of these.
It would be a very limited story, to be sure. But no, like going back to, again, now that you just meant, like what you
Somebody
just said.
leaves. That's it.
The boy got robbed and stabbed.
A mother tells her children, don't go out into the forest. The end. Right. But like, in more seriousness, because the more I think about it, the more we've been talking about it right now, I think it's more interesting and more pertinent that, think of it this way. The Lego analogy, I think, is pretty damn good, right? So you have your core Lego pieces, like the 6-block Lego piece is never going to change. You need that piece to build other shit, right? Mm. But you can put it this way, like place it like middle, you know, like on the map, like again, sticking with the analogy, on the Lego map, like the main board, right? You can start here or there, and then you build from that, Now, but you have to, of course, follow one with a logical progression of another. Like you start building stuff randomly, it'll look random and haphazard. You won't be building anything. Yeah, you have a lot of pieces stacked together, but you won't have a structure. Similarly, you won't have a coherent narrative if you start jamming them like randomly here, there, and you know everywhere else. So
I'm going to tell you when it stops being. I'm going to form a game here. Okay. Tell me when it stops being the same story in a way. The king's daughter is kidnapped by a dragon. A knight rides off, rescues her, comes back and becomes they get married. The king's daughter is turned to stone by an evil witch. A knight rides off to rescue her, succeeds, comes back and becomes prince. The peasant's sister gets kidnapped by the dragon. He rides off, rescues her, and lives happily ever after.
I mean, you would say like the last one is like the least traditional, like the least recognized as a story, or like that has like the least elements.
But I think you can basically.
But it still is that.
I think it's still the same thing, though. You know, like
right. I see what you're getting at, and I do agree.
There's not the marriage at the end of like, but you know, it's got the hero
got the same arc.
Goes and saves the, you know,
but it's not a knight, it's a peasant this time. It's
right. So
it's
those,
not the king's daughter. It's
maybe it's not as like epic feeling, I guess, in quotes, but it still has the same, of course.
Well, the
core
stakes
general
aren't
structure.
as high as theoretically when royalty.
Right.
You monarchist.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I'm saying in terms of like the general perception of the time and when these stories were produced, sure.
I think that the peasant cares about his sister as much, if not more, than the king cares about his daughter.
Sure.
Almost
Perhaps.
definitely.
I was never arguing it. I'm just saying, like, the perception is, at the time, like, you would see more of one written than the other because of the nature of society. But I still think they all, of course, serve and fulfill the same general structure and coherency of a story unto itself, unto themselves.
So I think I just wanted that as proof that I think Propp knew what he was talking about, that you can just switch in and out different elements, but they still represent the same thing.
100%. And anybody trying to write a story, just go back, write down every single one of the elements that we just said.
Yeah, exactly.
And, just make a story out of that.
And you're good to go. Exactly.
So do we have some more time?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, we got some time for you to...
So I'm going to go into a couple of the extra chapters that were at the end of this.
Okay, please.
Stuff that we didn't actually get to read, but that he followed up on, essentially.
So this one's kind of interesting. Assimilations, cases of double morphological meaning of a single function.
Okay.
Sounds intense.
Hit me up. Hit me with some knowledge.
These are rare, but they exist when one motif can actually have multiple... Or they seem like it's one motif, but they're actually different motifs.
Okay.
A hero builds a magical palace to win over the queen. A hero builds a magical palace as the end reward to his quest. The building of the magical palace is the exact same action, but with completely different
intentions. Yeah.
And what it really means, if you think of it as a mathematical formula, the input's the same, the output's different, and that occasionally does happen. Another example of it was the hunt for a dragon. The dragon kidnapped someone, thus the dragon is the villain. The queen, the single queen who is looking for a husband, tasks all suitors to go out and hunt the dragon.
Sure. Yeah,
the dragon is the target and not the villain.
Right. It'll certainly change the intention of the story. And he becomes the object of a search, but not the quote unquote villain with a capital V role in that circumstance.
That occasionally does happen. There's also other segments that can appear in a folktale that there are auxiliary content. One is basically the connective tissue.
Okay.
It's when...
Chris's favorite phrase. Go on.
Weird.
Go ahead.
Basically, so a man wakes up and his horse informs him that his
as horses do,
wife has run off. The information isn't a function, it's just passing along from one function to another.
Yeah. I like that. Sort of flowing from one to the other.
Goes from the magic horse to you.
And it can
Straight from the magic horse's mouth, dude.
It can be done as as straight information, or it can be done more elegantly, like someone set a trap to like that rang a bell that informed a trespasser.
Yeah.
Which that is not itself a function, but just information.
It's a prope.
Yeah. All right. Trebling. The use of three. The three witches in Macbeth, the three blind mice,
the three pendants and Link to the Past.
Yes. Three is, yes, exactly. Or the Triforce.
Mm-hmm.
All these kind of things are. The use of three is often found in folktales. So. The other one is motivation, which I actually have something to read from. So, talk while I find this.
All right. Hey,
yes,
guys, what's going on?
Stop talking.
I had nothing.
This is something. This is nothing. He's found it. Go.
So, motivation is the basically it allows the person telling the story to create more of a story around it by providing motivation for the characters.
Sort of
involved.
Backstory, essentially.
Exactly.
Like villain appears, but why does he appear? And why is he doing?
Yes,
why is he chasing?
And this is what's very varying between folktales and what keeps them as a mode of storytelling. So the quote here is, the majority of characters' acts in the middle of a folktale are naturally motivated
Motivated.
Well, hold on, is motivi like multiple motivations? Anyway.
Are naturally motivated by the process of the narrative. Only villainy, as the first basic function of the folktale, is in need of some kind of supplementary motivation. And I think that is absolutely fascinating. Because
a villain being a villain for no reason isn't interesting and doesn't help. It doesn't serve the story. In fact, it may detract.
I've always argued that in all films, the villain has to be the most interesting character in there. Any James Bond film, James Bond is one of these functions. He's a character you insert into whatever tale you're telling.
True.
What makes a good James Bond film or not is the villain involved. I think we all can agree that Sean Bean plays one of the best ones.
Yes.
And his motivation is fantastic. And
Great job.
Well, he was never a villain per se. He was more of like magical help for the villain, if you will.
He's the dragon.
Yes, exactly.
But even the what's the
which other one?
Goldfinger.
Goldfinger?
Yeah. He had great motivation. He had great lines. He's the most interesting. James Bond should never be the most interesting person in a James Bond film.
The villain should always be like. Yeah, I mean, like you're right. Like we and you personally, and all of us, I've agreed on many reviews that oftentimes what can make or break a story is the villain's motivation and or consequently lack thereof, right? And that will hugely influence like the story and how much you buy into it.
Yeah,
for sure. That's a very good point. And well done, Mother.
And that there's another kind of a paraphrase of that characters and attributes can be swapped, allows folktales to update through spatial temporal shifts.
Yes,
which is a weird way of saying
stories reverberate through time. Sure, I got you.
But it also allows you to take a story from another culture and insert your own characters into it and allow it to have life. And oftentimes throughout history, that has
been exactly the case. So yeah, for sure.
In fact, the Romans were very famous for doing that to the Greeks, and
the Christians to the Romans,
and so forth,
etc.
There's two other chapters involved which discuss when to insert characters into a folktale, which was interesting in an academic thing, but I don't think interesting to listen to.
Not as pertinent to it. Yeah.
My explanation for why it's not interesting was more interesting than the chapter.
Very nice. And very well said then.
And the final chapter is pretty dense, and I think that's oddly enough. You looked at an academic work on this, or a teaching tool for this, and it didn't cover this chapter. This is pretty because this is the chapter he actually applies his
to a story, right?
Story and a couple of other, but I think that's enough for us to bore our audience with.
No, I mean, like if you're interested in stuff, like again, we often make a joke that we sometimes are doing people's homework, but like in all seriousness, we enjoy discussing this stuff, and as we all mentioned, and I will personally say, this is the kind of narrative analysis that I'm into. Like, it makes sense to me the way he breaks it down, and once it is broken down and he sort of lays it out for you, you can see where it applies so broadly to just storytelling and how to structure it in general, that it's very, very fascinating to me to take a look at, and especially that this is one of the earlier works that attempted to do this, and as you said, with clarity and not trying to sort of alienate audiences or readers at the out front. In fact, trying to do away with that. I mean, like, listen, I will show you how it works. Here's how, here's why, here's the 31 points we just read out, right, earlier. And then, now that you know that, you can see it in other stories. You can apply it to your own stories if you so wish.
Yeah. What I really love to do is take stuff like this, and I think we did the same thing with Joseph Campbell, take stuff like this and apply it to modern stories and things like that and see how well it jives with that type of stuff.
Exactly. Like the Infinity War thing was
also
perfect.
Start to recognize their points as you're just casually watching things.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Campbell wrote this up 5 minutes later. Oh, Propp brought this up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, right, so I'm saying, like, if you know about this stuff and if it gets to you, then again, you can sort of see it in the pop culture stuff that we cover as well, like in general, and in your own daily life when you're watching a movie or a current TV show or what have you.
If you haven't noticed, if you are followed our philosophy channel for a while, we're more formalists than we are in modern day.
Certainly, again, we have an affinity for that
literary
brand.
Theory.
Yes, exactly.
I like how, while attempting to abstract a concept, they at least Campbell and Propp attempted to provide clarity, as you were mentioning.
For sure, yeah.
And I like how a number of those who deal with your interpretation is all that's important are obscure in everything they do.
Or at least oftentimes can be, we'll say. Many times.
No, I think that I think that of everything we've read, this is like the Campbell and perhaps Against Interpretation a little bit, or the most
to a maybe lesser degree,
have the most clarity to them. Even though saying Against Interpretation goes against my first point.
Indeed.
Take that, Dorita.
From Beyond the Grave. But no, for sure. This is one of the, I think, more enjoyable studies that we've done, even throughout our whole philosophy and narrative studies in general, since we started. And yeah, I think, again, it works so well. And if you like to think about and learn about this kind of stuff, this is one of the better ones to check out.
Oh, yes, I agree.
Absolutely. Give it a read. I think next we have Bakhtin. I think we're going to be doing next. So
going to Bakhtin it up.
Cream that you...
Yep. You rub it in when you get a cut.
Mm-hmm. And then you learn about philosophy and narrative at the same time.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
Uh-huh.
All right, so I'm Jonathan E. Manzer. Unless any of...
I think we're all set.
Yeah.
I'm Jonathan E. Manzer, here with Stephen Mosi.
Have a pleasant night.
And Scott Thilo.
And don't forget to plug and play your stories. Good night. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals Discusses Philosophy, Narrative, and the Mechanics of Criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan E. Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.